From Zurich, this is the Marketplace Europe debate, post-Davos. I'm Richard Quest. You join us in the Art Museum, a delightful auditorium, a wonderful audience, and a superb panel. And we are going to be discussing not just the Davos agenda, but looking forward through to 2014, so that you become aware and you are informed on the issues you need to know about in economics and business for the year ahead. Let me welcome our panel. Rohner is the chairman of Credit Suisse Group, the private investment bank. 46,000 people, I'm told you have. 50 countries. That's a lot of people in a lot of countries.
That's correct.
Which is an excellent reason for you to be here. Blanke is the chief economist of the World Economic Forum, an expert on competitiveness in Western Europe. If you can't tell us what Europe needs to do, then we're all in deep trouble. Jimenez is the chief exec of Novartis. Joe is, well, one of the world's largest multinational pharmaceuticals. And Ryder is the 10th Director General of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, representing the views of workers, employers, and governments. Guy has been a regular guest, and we're always delighted to have you on Quest Means Business. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel this evening. Jennifer, I want to start with you. We came down the mountainside from Davos, and we've now it's pretty clear. The growth in 2014 is going to come from advanced countries rather than emerging markets. Nominally, they may be higher, but the big gains will be in advanced economies. Europe is still the laggard.
That's true. I mean, we're seeing laggards everywhere. In Europe, there are particular problems. I think we're talking about maybe 1% growth in core economies this year. So I think basically what we're seeing is that things are looking a bit better. But at the same time, this is jobless growth. It is very, very restrained growth. And a lot still needs to be achieved in order to improve.
What needs to be achieved?
I think we need more confidence, and more confidence will come from leaders who are making the sorts of changes that are clearly going to make Europe more innovative and make the markets really work for Europeans.
As seen from the banking sector, what do you want to see in 2014 from governments and from leaders and economies?
I think that, governments should finish the job that they have started in terms of, if I take the banking sector, of doing the banking sector reform. In Europe, it's particularly the banking union, which has been decided but is not finished yet. I think that's something which has to be done. I think if the remaining pieces are done, then that's what ultimately will instill confidence back into the markets.
But you'd agree it's going to be slow and trudging forward, isn't it? There's no barn burner coming along.
Well, it's not something which you do overnight, but on the other hand, if you do it consistently and people can see progress, I think that will start moving, I would say, the confidence level further up, which is necessary.
Are you confident, Joe?
I am confident. I mean, I think
what?
I'm confident that Europe can grow. For example, 1% growth is weak growth, but I think what we've found is that innovation drives growth. So if you were to ask me what one thing I would ask of governments is reward for innovation. So in my sector, healthcare, we're engaged in high-risk activity. This is discovering and developing new and innovative medicines. There needs to be reimbursement for those medicines and reward for that innovation.
Guy, what do you expect? I mean, for Europe, we'll talk in more detail in a moment on the numbers of jobless that's out there, but what do you think we need to see?
Well, we certainly need to see everything that's just been said by my colleagues on the panel. It is really one of the sort of paradoxes of what we see today. There's an awful lot of liquidity in the banking system, not getting through to industry. There's an awful lot of accumulated profits in industry, not getting into investment. Somehow these have got to be unblocked, and I think a lot of that has got to do with uncertainty. I think Davos still revealed, despite the restored confidence that we've talked about, people wondering exactly where we're going. What's it going to take to get these people from the banking system, from industry, to start the money flowing again? I think that's the key.
The banking sector has been fortunate enough to borrow from central banks an all-you-can-eat buffet from the ECB. with LTROs and in the Fed, and I mean, there's no shortage. So why is there this blockage?
Well, a lot of that money actually stayed within the circle between government, central banks, and banks, and it has to go on to the corporate sector. And what I would think it needs, it will need to find mechanism as to how you can actually sell those corporate loans to, I think, to a wider public.
Well, looking more economy-wide, I think one of the big issues is the fragmentation of the financial markets in general in Europe still. We talk about a single market, but we don't see a single market. And so even though there's this money sloshing around, if you're in Spain and you're a company and you're trying to get credit, you still can't get that credit even though it's around, because people are actually still basically thinking that they're not going to actually get their investment back. So, and banks are quite nervous about this. So I think that there's a lot of other stuff, not just in the banks, but in the system in general, that's stopping this up.
Isn't this really what it's coming to? The single market isn't working. Joe?
Well, I think if you look at Europe from a healthcare standpoint, there's definitely the haves and the have-nots. There are countries that are able to reimburse and to provide a reward for innovation. You know, the healthcare industry invests about $30 billion a year in research and development in Europe, and a lot of that goes to Germany, to France, to some of the more developed nations.
The banks guy got us into this mess. And the banks, seemingly, I'm not beating you up too much.
Well, you know, we are not based in the Eurozone, as you know. We are a Swiss bank, so we have a slightly different regime and slightly different rules, and also slightly different history, I would argue.
But good of you to be here. The banks guy got us into this mess, and the banks are preventing us getting out of this mess.
Well,
True?
Well, I think they've got to play the role that they should play, which is providing the financial lubrication for the real economy. And self-evidently, it's still not happening. So we've got half of the story in the banking system. What is stopping industry from putting that money to good use?
I don't think it's the banks. I think it's the confidence that industry has to have to lean forward to invest in Europe and lean forward in investing in the economy.
What's it going to take, Jeff? What's it going to take?
It's going to take confidence that your investment is going to yield a return.
But isn't that circular? Because what's going to give you that confidence?
Well, we are investing because when we have something to invest behind, we will spend it. So, for example, at my company, at Novartis, we're launching a number of new medicines. So we're hiring people, salespeople, we're hiring marketing people and physicians that will help us sell this. So, again, I keep coming back to innovation. To the extent that we are rewarding innovation in Europe and we're promoting innovation, I think you're going to get investment.
But here you come back to that competitiveness gap, which is the fact that you have parts of Europe that are extremely innovative and others that are really not. And at the end of the day, it's really innovation that is driving productivity over the longer term that's going to provide those rising living standards, and we're just not seeing it in parts of Europe.
Beautifully, you've taken us on to innovation and competitiveness, which is where we're going to go after the break. But before we go to the break, more confident or less confident this year?
I would say it's more confident than...
You?
Yes.
I'm more confident.
More confident.
More confident, still worried.
More confident or less confident? All those of you in the audience who are more confident this year, hands up. All those of you that are less confident, hands up. Well, we are in Switzerland. When we come back after the break, we'll turn our attention to this dreaded phrase that we hear again and again, and you had all better be prepared to answer it. The phrase is structural reform. What does it mean? And why is it so important to the competitiveness of Europe? And if you do get structural reform, who's on the downside of it? This is Marketplace Europe, the debate. Welcome back to Zurich, the Marketplace Europe debate. Post-Davos, where now we're going to turn our attention to probably Europe's single biggest issue. And I think you'll all agree it is the so-called jobless recovery. We're going to start with you, Guy. Europe needs to create jobs. What's it doing wrong not creating them?
Well, initially what it's not doing right is it's not growing enough. I think until we get growth back into the European economy, it's illusory to think that we're going to have jobs. That's the first thing to say. So I agree with innovation, I agree with the competitiveness part. On the other hand, we need to get the economy going, and we need to look very, very carefully at the policies that we've applied to overcome the crisis and make sure that they're not actually stifling the quest for jobs in the first place.
Structural reform. I keep hearing this phrase, Jennifer. Last week at Davos, Minister Dijsselbloem, president of the Eurogroup, he basically said when we talk about structural reform, we've got to get used to the idea of longer hours, longer years, working more, pension reform, healthcare reform. It's all rather bleak when put like that.
Well, I mean, he was talking a lot about some of the outcomes he expects. He was expecting that we'll work longer hours and work for longer. But I think when we think about structural reform, it's more about the inputs. What are you actually doing? You're making it more flexible. You're allowing companies to decide how much they want to hire and fire, making it less expensive to fire and therefore less of a disincentive to hire. But that's only part of the story. That's the labor market. It's also about goods markets, making it easier to start a company, being entrepreneurial, and a lot of the other things that are important for competitiveness.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think a particular labor market reform is key, and you can see when you look at Germany 10 years ago and now, you can see that what an impact it can have. It will take a couple of years, but it will have a very significant impact if you get it right. And some countries in Europe, even some large countries, did not get it right so far.
In healthcare, structural reform is more about redeployment than about cutting. And when I say redeployment, I mean the cost of doing research and development is going up. And yet we have to do it. Therefore, we have to put more money in research and development, which means we have to take money from some of the back office functions, human resources, finance, et cetera. And so we're redeploying some of our funds, hiring in some areas and reducing in others.
You're holding yourself in reserve there, Guy.
If you want to get people into jobs, out of jobs, you've got to help them as well. And that's about training, that's about social security provision, it's about what people talk about the equation between greater flexibility, but looking after people, helping them too. But if it's a one-way street, I'm afraid it won't work.
But doesn't it inevitably turn into a one-way street? Because what tends to happen is you get the flexibility that you're talking about, you get the redeployment that you're talking about, but you don't get the safety net or the other aspects of that you're talking about.
That's not true. I mean, you do see that in much of Europe. If you look at Denmark, it's the classic flexicurity system. It's an expensive system,
yeah, but
it's
that's
a system that works.
The competitiveness issue again.
It is a competitiveness issue. I mean, but the thing is that all of our talent is very important. You have to make sure that you deploy it properly. One of the big issues we're seeing in Europe right now is that you have skills gap. You have a lot of well-qualified young people, but they don't have the skills needed by the business sector. So a lot of what needs to be done is, and again, it's coming back to the structural reform, getting business talking to government about what they need young people to be learning before they come out.
We've got 12% or so unemployment, give or take, at any given moment. In Spain, 1 and 2, if you have a job and you're under 25, you are the exception. Structural reform is going to take a very long time before it creates real jobs in any meaningful numbers, Jennifer.
Well, that's not really true, because I think there's short-term things you can do, including, I do think, making the labor market more flexible in a very short period of time. That can do a lot.
Easier to hire and fire.
I completely agree with that, because Europe is not an island. If you think about who Europe is competing with for resources of a company like Novartis, think about the flexibility of the labor market in Asia versus in Europe. And so to the extent that we could have a more flexible labor market here, there would be more investment.
And clearly it is urgent to do it, because otherwise you risk of losing a whole generation of young people, sometimes very well trained.
We've lost them arguably, we've lost that generation already.
I don't think so. I would not be prepared to accept that as a statement. I think we should do everything in order not to lose them, but we have to do it, and we have to do it quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's really scary, and I think if it's any incentive, think about the fact that these are tomorrow's leaders. If we lose this generation, who is going to lead tomorrow?
Hire and fire. Make it easier to hire and fire. Why aren't you frothing at the mouth?
Oh, no. Beware the simple answers. The countries that do this well, the countries who've got adaptable labour markets, to use a neutral phrase, have extremely sophisticated labour market institutions, and they are the most competitive in Europe. The Finns, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Swiss, I would say too. So it isn't simply a question of stripping out all of the institutions, all of the rules, getting it flexible. you're going to, and you know, 2009 in Davos, what was the refrain? My God, too much flexibility. Let's get some floors into labour markets. The lessons are too quickly forgotten.
Switzerland has among the most liberal labour laws in Europe, and we have added 3,000 employees here in the last 3 years. So I think that there's absolute proof that the more flexible the labour market, the more investment you're going to see.
So when Eric Schmidt at Davos last week warns that there's a battle about to take place between computers and people, and it's a battle that the people have to win, did you understand what he meant, Jennifer?
Well, I mean, he means obviously that technology can displace workers in the short term.
But it's already done it.
Yeah, and it's done it many, many times. I think that this time people are aware that it might even displace more workers because it is increasing productivity enormously.
To the unemployed in Spain, to the underemployed in Ireland, to the trainee in the United Kingdom, what would you say tonight to give them hope that our generation hasn't completely cocked it up? Any of you, join in. We'll start with you, Guy.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think they'll be convinced by explanations. I think they'll be more convinced by actually getting opportunities to get a job. They have to believe somehow that what we all talked about up the mountain is going to feed into some sort of action. And really, I think they'll be little convinced by words. I think they'll be convinced by people actually doing. And that's really the challenge.
And what needs to be that first action on this question of the jobs? Let's start with you, Joe, because you're running a big company.
Yes.
How many employees?
130,000.
130,000. That's an extraordinarily large number. How many countries?
60 countries.
It's got 10 more than you.
And a lot more people too.
A lot more people.
My advice to individuals in Europe is to think about innovation and convincing governments that innovation is going to be the key to accelerating growth. We need an accelerator.
And your R&D budget is how much, roughly?
My R&D budget is over $9 billion a year, and we spend over 30 billion euro a year in Europe as an industry.
Of course, there is one innovation, there is one structural reform that's taken place. Interns in the financial industry may actually get a weekend off. When we come back after the break, we turn our attention to what sort of model we want for Europe in the years ahead. In a moment. Welcome back to the Marketplace Europe debate, post-Davos. Jennifer, as the chief economist of the fund, I would be astounded if you said it was a complete and utter waste of time. You're not even going to go there, are you? But was it worth it? And if so, where does its worth come?
Well, I absolutely think that it's worthwhile. I think we, first of all, have to remember that, I mean, there's a lot of value in discussion. So we do have the leaders who are able to make changes there, but that it's only one part of a process. We're actually driving a lot of these issues on a longer-term basis.
Does it pay dividends, do you think? When, I mean, merely having a forum where somebody like yourself, Guy, can talk to somebody like yourself, and you can put together different views?
I think it's very important. We do that, and we do that sometimes in open discussion, sometimes behind closed doors. I think that's extremely valuable. And you know, I had personally very interesting, sometimes also fairly controversial discussions.
But I mean, in the end,
on different topics, on topics of governance and topics on how the system should work in the future and so forth.
I definitely think it's worthwhile and valuable. And I agree the exchange of views, the coming together is important. But I really sort of come back down thinking, well, what happens next? And one of the encouraging things about this Davos was CEO after CEO putting their hand up and saying, we want to do something about youth unemployment. We will do something in our company. Lots of CEOs saying that, and some follow-up expected. That's good news.
One difference that I would say what I saw compared to last year or the year before was people were really talking about growth and how to stimulate growth.
Yeah, I think that's the key.
Basically fixing the crisis.
That's the key for me. I think it's very valuable. I chaired the Health and Economic Summit, which brought together just in a room of 60 people, prime ministers, health ministers, finance ministers, industry, and we talked about how we're going to use healthy populations to drive economic growth. And where else could you have had a conversation like that over a 2-hour?
It comes back to what Guy's question, real point was. How you take it forward, how you make something meaningful. Joe, you are a CEO. How do you take it meaningfully forward?
I don't think it is the collective taking it forward that is really the value of the forum. I think engaging in the debate and the discussion and allowing me to see the different opinions that are forming and make my decisions about where I'm going to invest. I think that's the value.
Well, I'm going to bring this right down to grassroots level. Post-Davos, when you next go back into your boardroom or into your CEO suite, your chairman's suite in your case, but what are you going to say to somebody that takes this forward?
Well, I will say that, I got the impression that by speaking to a number of politicians, in particular European politicians, I got the impression that they are convinced and determined to move the European agenda forward, that they're going to trying to fix unfinished business, for instance, in our industry, in the banking industry. Banking union will take some time to do it, but they're convinced that they have to do it and they will do it. Things like that, that will reinforce our belief if we have discussions about where to invest, what to do, how to grow our business. That's one element which we'll take into consideration, of course.
Much more modest achievement. I've got a list of 4 or 5 companies who want to work with us to give young people training, apprenticeship places, experience. Right. That's great. That'll do me.
Okay, now, what sort of model do you now see Europe moving towards? Do you see a more brutal model for employment, for the business environment for the year ahead? Are we starting to look more like the US or maybe more towards Asia's model?
I don't think you will see a complete change of model, but what is clearly and apparent to everybody is unless you have labor market reforms in those countries where the labor market doesn't really work, there will be no growth. And if people see that and understand that, then that's where you see the change.
Yeah, I think European governments need to step back and really understand that they're competing in a global marketplace. It was exactly almost a paradox of you saying, is it going to be a more brutal Europe? No, while it might feel like that, that is what will unlock growth that is greater than 1%.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I very much appreciate it. One thing has become absolutely clear from our discussion, both at Davos and here tonight, that there is a sea change underway. People are more optimistic, to be sure, after years of misery and recession. But now, of course, in many ways, the hard work begins. And that's our Marketplace Europe debate from Zurich. I'm Richard Quest in Switzerland. Whatever market you're in, I hope it's profitable. I'll see you next week.